We are recording. So let's jump into what was discussed in your breakout room. We have 3 points of conversation on the table: the differences and similarities between the style of oration with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, the differences and similarities in the message between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and what new understandings or revelations did you gain from Martin Luther King through the engagement of this particular text? Who would like to start off talking about what was discussed in your breakout rooms? So, Heidi, what was discussed in your breakout room?
Uh, no one really talked in my breakout room. So
Okay. Um, Juan, what was discussed in your breakout room?
Something I wanted to talk about was
Something you wanted to talk about, or what you talked about?
oh, I didn't talk about it because I usually use like the breakout room to get my thoughts in order because nobody else is talking.
So, what did you want to talk about, Juan?
So I wanted to talk about the difference between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like what I got between the two, like the difference, was that Martin Luther King Jr. he was more non like he supported nonviolent protests, I guess I would say,
Mm-hmm.
and Malcolm X was like more active.
Okay.
If that, I don't know if that's the right word choice, but do you agree with that?
Um, yeah, yes and no. It can be complicated in the sense that one could say that Martin Luther King was very active, but he was active in a non-violent way, right? So I think it would come down to like how you would define action, right? But I wouldn't say that you're wrong. Um, Peori, what did you guys discuss in your breakout room? Pajori, what did you discuss in your breakout rooms? Christian, what was discussed in your breakout rooms?
First, we were talking about number one. We thought that both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, they really had confident and powerful speeches, which kind of inspired the audiences and it showed like their intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And also that we thought that they were different because MLK he kind of engaged in like non-violent protests, while Malcolm X he thought fighting for equality in like any means necessary.
Okay. Thank you, Christian. Anybody want to talk about the new understandings or a new revelation that they found through engaging this particular text of Martin Luther King, or if did anybody have any new revelations?
It just seemed like Martin Luther King was like afraid for his life a lot of like throughout his fame, and like that informed a lot of his speech.
Yeah, I think especially this speech, right? Like you hear the fear, you hear the trepidation, and you could tell that he feels that his life won't be much longer than too much longer after that speech was given. So with that being said, right, the speech is titled "I Have Been to the Mountaintop." It's delivered April 3rd, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee. He was organizing at the time for the sanitation workers in Tennessee, and this would be his last speech before his assassination. I want to say a few days after he delivers the speech. So what Serena is mentioning and what she's attentive to is spot on, right? Um, his life is being greatly threatened. So for me, some of the things that stood out, first thing that stood out was the pace of Martin Luther King's speech. His diction was very slow and drawn out. He utilizes the pause, right? There's a lot of dead space in his speech. And for me, I cannot, um, I cannot gloss over the fact of where he's given the speech and who his audience is, right? So Memphis, Tennessee, that's the southern portion of the United States. I don't know how many of y'all spend time down south, but I spend a good amount of time in Jackson, Tennessee, which is in between Memphis and Nashville. And it's very slow. Everything happens slow as fuck. You go to get fast food, you think you're going to be there for 15, 20 minutes, you end up being there for 45 minutes to an hour. So it makes sense as to why his cadence was so slow. He wanted to make sure that his audience would be receptive to the message. And I don't think that they would be as receptive to the message if he was speaking with a very quick diction. So again, I think a lot of that has to do with his location and his audience, okay? Also, he's a preacher, so the style of delivery is very much likened to being inside the pulpit, right? One of the similarities that we find in the message between Malcolm and Martin is this notion of unity among the oppressed of the world, right? So he uses Pharaoh and those who were enslaved in Egypt as an example, and he says anytime that Pharaoh wanted to maintain power or subvert the power of the enslaved, he made sure that he kept the enslaved divided, which led MLK to believe that once the enslaved unite, they could forever end the system of enslavement. Also very similar to Malcolm in the evolution of thought, Martin Luther King goes from a civil rights focus to a human rights focus, looking at the human rights issues facing all people of color throughout the world, and he's calling for a human rights revolution. So this is very similar to what Malcolm X is calling for, and it's very radical from a auditory standpoint than what you've heard from Martin Luther King in the past, right? He doesn't really talk about words and use words like revolution. He's organizing for the workers' rights, and he's also calling for the United States to live up to the claims that they say that they're about, right? So if you're going to say you're about the pursuit of liberty, justice, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then you must make sure that that is the case for all of your citizens, right? If you're going to write these things like the Constitution, you have to ensure that all members of your society have the benefits and the rights that are granted in the Constitution, not just a specified segment. One of the differences in message between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X believes that politics and religion should be separate, it should be bifurcated, which is why he creates the Organization of Afro-American Unity to address the political, and he creates the Muslim Mosque Incorporated to address the religious. Martin Luther King believes the opposite. He believes there should be an intersection between religion and politics. In fact, he names and big ups all the preachers who are on stage with him because they engage in the human rights struggle at a very active capacity. He also says that being engaged in the human rights movement is something that Jesus would do, right? Jesus hung out among the poor and the downtrodden, right? And he believes that this is the work that preachers should be doing, and which causes him to focus on the poor people, on the issues of the poor, and establish the poor people's movement. And through doing so, and through his articulation of his focus on the poor people's movement, he offers a critique of what he calls self-serving preachers, saying that they should place their congregation and their people's needs before their own personal needs. And again, he uses the parable of the Good Samaritan to help prove that point. One of the another similarities between Malcolm and Martin is they both understand very keenly the power of the economic dollar, the power of the economic power base of the Black community. Martin says that at that time in 1968, the Black dollar was worth $30 billion, right? And he says that there's only 8 nations who had financial wealth that superseded the black folks globally, right? So, and for him, that $30 billion can be used to boycott institutions like Coca-Cola who are not serving the interests of Black folks, right? Whereas for Malcolm, he's looking at that $30 billion as a base to establish independence for African people within the Americas. So they both understand the power of the collective black dollar, but their means of utilizing that power is different. And I think that reigns true for a lot of what the differences between Malcolm and Martin. They both have the same objective. Their means of getting to that objective is slightly different. And then ultimately, to Serena's point, right, there's an urgency in King's message, right? He senses the impending doom that will approach him very soon. You hear it in statements like, I may not get there with you, right? Longevity has its rewards, right? So he knows what's coming. He knows that death is very near, and you hear that in the urgency and the tempo of how he speaks to close out that particular speech. So those are my notes. We'll transition into our fishbowl. Again, if you've gone twice, you're good for the semester. If you've gone one time, then you would need one more. And if you have not gone, you probably need to hop on it because we won't have too many opportunities to fishbowl before the semester closes out. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer for fishbowl?
I'll go.
Okay, Heidi, thank you. Anyone else?
I'll go.
All right, Troy, thank you, because I was actually about to call on you, so that's pretty smart on your part. One more volunteer. If someone wants to volunteer, we have space for one more. All right. If I call on you and you've been twice, just let me know and you're good. Monica, have you gone twice for your fishbowl?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Monica. Yasmin, have you gone twice for your fishbowl?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Serena, have you gone twice for your fishbowl?
Yes.
Thank you, Serena. Christian, have you gone twice for your fishbowl?
Yeah, I have.
Okay, thank you. Jen Lynn, you've gone twice, haven't you?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jen Lynn. Jelani, I'm pretty sure you went twice too, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we'll just go with Heidi and Piotrek because you're the only two who have not gone twice. So whoever wants to start it off, it's on you.
I'll go. So I just wanted to talk more about what you said about the U.S. is portrayed as the land of like free choice, religion, and the pursuit of happiness, and how I remember it in high school. I did a paper on this exactly how the Statue of Liberty is actually like the symbol of that, and how people who migrated here had to pass through that when they were going to New York, and it's just sad, obviously, because it still hasn't lived up to that that envisionment, that dream that people had when they were first when they first wrote the Declaration of Independence, right? Yeah. So yeah, just I like that when that MLK also called it out, in the speech. So yeah.
Thank you, Heidi.
I wanted to get back on the group, the discussion about how Martin Luther King and Malcolm X was like, they had like kind of similarities. Martin Luther King was like a global political mobilizer in the way in which he framed the idea of racial justice globally is very important. And the way Malcolm X was like the first modern activist who was really saying Black Lives Matter in a really deep and definitive way, become the activator of the Black Power movement.
All right, thank you guys. So let's deal. 1 second. Stephanie, have you went twice for your fishbowl already? Stephanie? Stephanie Valencia, have you fishbowl twice? All right. So I want to kind of pick back up. Who was it? I want to say. One second, y'all. So I want to say it was Juan, who kind of wanted to say Martin Luther King was nonviolent. Malcolm X was more active, is how he positioned it. And I think part of the oscillation with Juan is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Juan, it sounded like you wanted to say he was violent, but then kind of scaled back on that and chose active as you felt that was more of an appropriate description. Am I wrong, Juan? Or
I wouldn't say I wanted to say violent, but more so, I'm not sure. I think active, it's not the right word either, but it's closer to what I'm trying to say.
yeah, and I only bring this up because Juan's thinking is common, right? When we think about these two figures, we put them in two camps: um, violence and nonviolence, right? Malcolm X being the violent one, Martin Luther King being the nonviolent one. So let's problematize that and let's tease that out a little bit. Somebody tell me, where is their historical records? Where is their historical account of Malcolm X or anyone tied to Malcolm X being violent?
I don't know if there is, but I've just heard that like Malcolm X like rejected the like theory of nonviolence, saying that like we shouldn't embrace nonviolence until basically our oppressors do the same. Like,
yeah, and so to Serena's point, right? That's vastly different than being violent, right? Because there is no historical record of Malcolm X or anyone tied to Malcolm X being violent. It just isn't there. So where do we get this assumption from? Also, right? Let's look at the flip side. Um, so in the chat, Jen Lin says Malcolm X just talks more aggressively, right? Martin Luther King is a little more precautious. So let's deal with that because she's absolutely right. Where the peg of violence gets placed on Malcolm X is the rhetoric. So it's a rhetorical violence that Malcolm utters. And I would go a step further and I would say that it is not in fact violence that Malcolm is talking about. He's talking about self-defense, right? And to Serena's point, Malcolm is willing to accept any method, mechanism, or methodology that will allow black folks to get free, right? Hence, by any means necessary. But again, let's deal with the nonviolent Martin Luther King and the nonviolent civil rights movement. So there was a few organizations within the civil rights movement. The more predominant organizations were the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, ran by Martin Luther King. Then you had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, ran by the likes of Stokely Carmichael, formerly, or Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, right? In Loudon County, I want to say in 1965, SNCC was organizing the people of Loudon County around voters' rights, and they were establishing what were called freedom schools. The purpose of these freedom schools were to educate the blacks of that area around politics, around local politics, right? To provide them African history lessons. They played speeches of Malcolm X. And just to overall uplift the consciousness of this area. Now, Loudon County is extreme at the time, an extremely racist. Some would say probably the most racist county in America at that time. The Ku Klux Klan ran rapid. The sheriff was very much in line with Ku Klux Klan activities. They never stopped it. So what would happen as they are organizing these freedom schools and as they're educating the African people of Loudous County, the Klan would ride, throw Molotov cocktails into the schools. They would shoot up the schools. And so what SNCC did is organize a defense community for that. Is anybody familiar or has anyone heard of the Deacons of Defense? The Deacons of Defense. That sound familiar to anyone? So the Deacons of Defense is a group that started out in New Orleans, who heard about what was going on in Loudous County, drove to Loudous County and said that we're willing to offer you armed defense, right? So this idea grew, and SNCC would go to all the major cities in the United States, organize the most radical factions, and bring them back to Loudous County to be part of the Deacons for Defense. So the next time that the Klan tried to ride on the freedom schools, the Deacons of Defense defended those schools, and there was active shootouts that took place between the Klan and the Deacons of Defense to secure the freedom schools. So again, this is an organization tied to Martin Luther King, an organization directly involved in the nonviolent civil rights struggle, right? But you don't hear about these stories. And we draw this very clean, neat line that says Martin Luther King is nonviolent, Malcolm X is violent, although the historical record would support the inverse of that reality, right? Because we have a historical record of members of the civil rights movement engaging in violent, and I wouldn't even call it violence, engaging in self-defense, where you don't have the record of that from Malcolm X. So why is it that America draws this neat line of division between these two historical figures? What do you think, what purpose does that serve?
Like divisiveness, saying there's like, oh, this is a good way to be in a minority and there's a bad way.
Another way to think about what Serena is saying is this idea of respectability politics. Is anybody unfamiliar with the term respectability politics? Is that unfamiliar to anyone? All right, so we all understand what that is. So yeah, Martin Luther King serves as the ideal symbol for respectability political protest, right? So even when a protest is nonviolent, it's compared to how Martin Luther King did his protest. Colin Kaepernick, right? A very nonviolent protest. But they all said, well, Dr. King wouldn't do it like that, right? So he's held to this standard that devalues all other types of protest that isn't done in the same fashion as Dr. King, right? So what could you gather that says about how Dr. King's protest is viewed from the power structure? Let me know if you need me to restate that question. So we'll approach it this way. The I Have a Dream speech, that's widely recognized as Martin Luther King's most famous speech. What is that speech about? What is he advocating for in the I Have a Dream speech?
American unity, between all creeds.
Yep, this idea of integration, right? Racial harmony, right? What is the main thesis of this I've been to the Mountaintop speech? What is he really advocating for in this particular speech?
Nationalism?
Yeah, it's a form of nationalism. Yeah, definitely.
I mean, I know he sort of, at this time, went from like small scale protesting to saying, let's take this to DC, You know, he talked about the Homestead Act and just saying, you know, it's time to get our money, time to get our checks. I know he was into reparations at that time.
That's it right there, Jelani. His focus has turned to the economy, right? It went from a racial focus, I have a dream, integration, racial harmony, to an economic focus. So let's look at this I've been to the mountaintop speech, right? Some of the themes of the speech. He's organizing for the workers' rights, looking at the sanitation workers, right? Attentive to the poor people's movement, so looking at the issues of the poor, right? Focusing on the economic power of the Black community and how they can use that $30 billion, right? So these are all economic issues that Martin Luther King is dealing with. Let me ask you this. Are there more poor people in the world, or are there more Black people in the world? Not rhetorical, real question. Are there more poor people, or are there more Black people?
Poor.
More poor, right? There's white poor, there's Black poor, there's indigenous poor, there's Asian poor. Poor cuts across cultural barriers, right? So if you are to organize a movement around people who are poor, how vast will that movement be, right? Again, cutting across racial and ethnic barriers. If you are going to organize a movement strictly around Blackness, there's going to be limitations to how big that movement can get, right? So when I ask you, what does the power structure's affinity towards the practices of Martin Luther King say about the power structure's views of protest? It comes down to this. Martin Luther King was able to advocate for integration all he wanted to and not be viewed as a threat, right? At best, a pest, right? At best, a hindrance, at best, an inconvenience. But when his conversation went from integration to reallocation of wealth, he had to be neutralized, right? I don't even think that he lived 1 week after he gave this speech. So what's more of a threat to the United States? Racial harmony or reallocation of wealth?
Green power.
Green power. Everything comes back to that money. So there's an age-old debate within the discipline of Africana studies, Pan-African studies, Black studies. What is the real reason for enslavement? What is the real reason for the system of white inferiority, right? Is it racism or is it economics, right? And if you do your research and you pay close attention, you know that it's not racism, right? You know that racism was created as a justification for economic exploitation of people and of land, right? Eric Williams put out a phenomenal book that articulates this fact very concisely. It's called Capitalism and Slavery, and he deals directly with the problem of of enslavement being the first iteration of capitalism, right? So it's always goes back to what Jelani is saying, it's green power, right? This is why no one's, well, I ain't gonna say no one. There's very few people who are familiar with this speech, I've been to the mountaintop, and more people are familiar with I Have a Dream, right? What are your thoughts? Whose style of oration or whose style of speech giving speaks more to you, Malcolm or Martin? And again, not the message, but the style. Let's just talk about the style.
I would think Malcolm reaches more to people growing up in an urban setting like we are in the cities where things are more fast paced. And like you said, you know, MLK was sort of speaking to his audience in the South. And, you know, Malcolm speaking in Harlem and Chicago, you know, these centers of intelligence. And so everybody's pretty sharp to some point. So Malcolm can kind of just move at a faster pace, but, you know, both styles obviously work.
Yeah. Jen Lynn, you said Malcolm. Why do you feel Malcolm speaks more to you? Do me a favor, Janelle. If you're going to respond via chat, do it to everyone so everyone can see what you're posting. She's saying that the way he delivers his speech, it makes her actually want to act on what he's saying, right? So the passion that he's giving allows her, it inspires her. If I could, put words into your mouth, Janelle. Who else? Anyone favor Martin above Malcolm? So you all agree that you would rather go with Malcolm than Martin. But Jory, whose style speaks to you more, Malcolm or Martin? But Jory, you there?
Yes.
Yeah. Whose style of speech do you favor, Malcolm or Martin?
I'm gonna be honest. I'll say Malcolm X,
Why Malcolm?
because it's just the way he it's just like fighting back for yourself. I feel that was like more unique compared to like just like letting them beat on you and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what Pajori is picking up on is what made Malcolm popular, right? You got to kind of take yourself back to the early 60s, the late 50s. No one's talking about swinging back, right? It's just not a conversation that you hear in a public forum, let me say. We talking about it, but we just ain't talking about it in public. That's that's the conversations that we have amongst ourselves, right? And one of the things that made Malcolm popular is that he would take the conversations that black folks were having in their living room, in the barbershop, and on the street corner, and he would spit it out on the soapbox. And he would do it in a fashion that exhibited no fear, right? And that appealed to people. People were getting tired of the subservient, ho-hum, docile position that a lot of the civil rights movement people took, right? And I would argue that I think historically, I think this is true. I would argue that historically, African people took more of Malcolm's position than they did Martin's position. Why would I say that? Why do you think I would say that? Historically, our experiences align more with Malcolm's rhetoric than it does Martin's rhetoric. Why would I say that? No ideas?
Well, I mean, in general, like the last 1,000 years or so, the world has wanted a piece of Africa, wanted to, just take as much as they can. So that's sort of like, Africa fighting back to just all the powers trying to take them down or, exploit them or, carve them up.
Absolutely. So historically, African people wasn't talking no nonviolence, right? It took over 2 centuries, right, for the Arabs to invade Africa from the east. It took over 5 centuries for Europe to make its way into Africa. This wasn't due to nonviolence, right? That prolongation of invasion was strictly due to military force and power, right? In fact, it wasn't until the gunpowder came into the play that either Europe or Arab and Asian countries were able to make their way into Africa. Okay. During enslavement, African people were talking about no nonviolence. Haiti produced a successful slave revolt, right? That was the first nation to successfully fight their way out of enslavement. That wasn't done nonviolently. Nat Turner, not done nonviolently. Denmark Vesey, not done nonviolently, right? So historically, African people are about this idea of self-defense. So that's why I say Malcolm's rhetoric is more aligned with the historical experiences of African people. Where did Martin Luther King get nonviolence from?
Gandhi?
Gandhi, absolutely. Let me ask you, how does Gandhi feel about black people, if y'all know?
I heard he was racist.
Hella racist. Where is Gandhi from, if you know, Serena?
India.
Mm-hmm. So in the Hindu religion, they operate within a caste system.
Yeah.
The lower part of that caste system is people who look like me. Keep in mind, the majority of India look like me from a color standpoint. Okay, so to me, I find it ironic, and I'll use that term just to be polite. I find it ironic that a person who has a whole philosophy of nonviolence has a disdain towards black skin. This philosophy is picked up by a person of darker hue, and this philosophy infuses a whole movement that is identified as the greatest protest movement in our country's history. That's suspicious to me, especially when I know the history of African people, and this notion of turning the other cheek and being nonviolent is not aligned with our history. Serena, were you going to say something?
Just that it seemed like his Martin Luther King's legacy has been sort of whitewashed to some extent, to be sort of, people use it today to justify this color blindness theory when that's not really what he was about.
Yes, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I wouldn't be surprised if they try to do the same thing with Malcolm X in the near future. I really believe what revitalized Malcolm for a newer generation was the work of Spike Lee, the 92 film X, that created a cultural renaissance that allowed people to kind of identify with Malcolm at a capacity that kept him alive amongst the youth culture. Also, his directness. And I want to say non-fear, but I don't think that's accurate, right? He's human, so he had to have fear. But his ability to move in spite of fear is something that the hip hop generation picked up and utilized. You don't hear too many hip hop songs sampling Martin Luther King, but you hear a lot of hip hop songs sampling and using the speeches of Malcolm X, right? Jelani, were you gonna say something?
Is that because they're not, emphasizing these speeches of this period from 64 to 68? There just needs to be more research and get these speeches back into the forefront. You can see this new Martin, and there might be some samples of Martin if they just had these speeches that are, post I Have a Dream.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Jelani. And matter of fact, I misspoke because I'm thinking about it. I don't know if y'all how deep into hip hop you are, but there's an artist by the name of Jay Electronica who actually sampled this very speech that we're dealing with this week. So to Jelani's point, right, it may be the way that Martin is being presented is not appealing to youth culture of today and I would say the 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? Because to Serena's point, he's been whitewashed so much that it almost is something that Black folks take disavow towards. I know for me, because of how Martin Luther King was delivered, I kind of looked at him as a sellout in my youth before I knew better, right? And that's a direct result of the Americanization of Martin Luther King and not being attentive to the 1964 through 1968 Martin Luther King. So I think between Serena and Jelani, they're giving us a very comprehensive understanding of why these two individuals have been situated the way that they have. Any last minute questions, comments, or concerns? All right, so let me point out to you all your reading for next week. Give me 1 second. All right, so for next week, we're kind of moving through the genealogy. We dealt with civil rights. We dealt with Black nationalism. We're going to transition into Black power and Pan-Africanism.